What happens to our bodies after death isn't a topic that people generally like to dwell on very much. And when someone you love dies, the last thing that anyone should be worried about is the treatment of their deceased loved one's body. It should be a given that when you spend thousands on funeral services, the deceased should be treated with dignity and respect. But in this case, the community my parents grew up in was absolutely shaken by what was discovered about the local crematory and its practices. This case hits close to home for me because of the fact that my grandfather was discovered on the grounds at this crematory. And my mother lived about a half-mile from the crematory as a child and was exposed to all of the evidence of this before the perpetrator was ever caught. I grew up with this story and I was there to watch some of the aftermath unfold. In a quiet, unincorporated town in rural Georgia, a town with no school, no mayor, no local government whatsoever, hundreds of families entrusted their loved ones to what seemed to be a normal, reputable crematory. But hidden from public view was an unimaginably terrifying secret, one that would unfold into arguably the most disturbing funeral scandal in American history. The Tri-State Crematory was originally run by Tommy and Clara Marsh, a married couple local to the small town of Noble, Georgia, with a population of around 300 people. The two ran the Tri-State Crematory from the mid-1970s up until 1996, when their son Brent Marsh took over the operation. The Marsh family was very well respected in the community, and their history reflected the hard-won progress of a black family whose grandparents had just been emancipated from slavery. Brent Marsh had an upper-middle-class, small-town upbringing. As a child and teenager, he was a standout athlete. He was described as a star sprinter and was the co-captain of the Lafayette High School football team. After high school, he earned a scholarship to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and he played as a linebacker for their football team. He was an honor student, active in sports, and was pretty popular at the college that he was attending. He was majoring in sports management. But by the mid-90s, Brent Marsh had to drop out of college to take over the family business, as his father Tommy Marsh had had a stroke and become disabled. He gave up his dreams of a career in sports. Family had to come first at this point. And in 1996, Brent stepped into his father's role and took over the operation of the Tri-State Crematory. Brent's father was trusted by funeral directors all across the region. He was known to be discreet, timely, and reasonable with his pricing. His clients, mostly small-town funeral homes, relied on him to handle the final step, the burning of the body, so the ashes could be given to the grieving families. After Brent took over, funeral homes all across Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama continued sending bodies to Tri-State, under the assumption that operations were continuing as normal. There was just one problem. Though he was taking over the operation, Brent Marsh had no qualifications. He was not licensed to operate a crematory. But in Georgia at the time, he didn't need to be. The state had virtually no regulations on this. No mandatory inspections, and no system for verifying whether a body was actually cremated or not. So business just kept coming. Funeral homes continued to send bodies by the truckload. Brent accepted them all. He signed the paperwork, he took the money, and then he didn't burn them. A man named Gerald Cook, a propane transport driver, delivered gas to the Tri-State Crematory, which was used as fuel to burn the bodies. As he was unloading, he noticed several severed body parts scattered across the property, with skin falling off, clearly in the later stages of decomposition. Gerald stared at the body parts, beginning to feel sick as he began to realize that something had to be wrong here. Then, Brent Marsh saw and called out to him, trying to get his attention. Gerald pretended he didn't see anything, out of fear of what Brent Marsh might do if he knew that he was staring at the remains. Brent directed him to the propane tank, and Brent followed him there to watch him fill it up. After finishing, Gerald quickly left in his truck. Instead of returning back to the office, he drove aimlessly for around 30 minutes or so, not knowing what to make out of what he had just seen. He concluded that something had to be wrong. He did not yet know that this would be one of the biggest, most expensive investigations in Georgia history. Eventually, he drove back to the office and told his boss what he had seen. His boss contacted the county sheriff, Steve Wilson. The sheriff brushed it off, saying that Brent must just be behind on cremating bodies, and that surely it couldn't be intentional or malicious. Why would anyone be shocked to find bodies at a crematory? It just seemed like a regulatory issue. Funeral regulatory services were not a thing at that time, so there was no one to call about it. He sent a few deputies to inspect the property. Nothing suspicious was found, yet. The sheriff knew the Marsh family, and like I said before, they were very well respected in the community. So nothing came of the reports. But a year later, in February 2002, Gerald Cook had to go back to the crematory for another propane delivery. As he drove to the site, he was already feeling uneasy after what he had seen before the last time he went. He arrived, parked, and went to go refill the propane tank. To the left side, he saw a full human body, appearing like a melted wax figure. Skin melting off, no discernible facial features remaining. Brent was standing next to him. He saw Gerald looking at the body, and he didn't say a word about it for a while. Gerald tried to ignore it, and just continued filling the propane tank. After a while, Brent said that they were having issues with the septic tank, and that they were behind on the bodies because of it. There was no construction equipment, no dirt piles. There was no evidence that Brent was working on this alleged problem with the septic tank. It seemed like a lie, which it was. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. But he didn't want to talk to the sheriff again. He knew that he would be dismissed. Gerald had an aunt, Faye, who was an assistant at an FBI office in Walker County. He called her instead, telling everything that he had seen. So Faye called the Environmental Protection Agency in Atlanta, saying that she had found body parts near a creek next to the crematory while she was walking her dog. They came to investigate. They parked on the Marsh's property, showed their badges, and went back to the creek where the remains were allegedly spotted. At first, they couldn't seem to find anything. Just trees, a dense layer of leaves, and small bodies of water. But right before giving up on their search, they stumbled upon a human skull. They began recording on a camcorder and called 911. Then the police show up. They call the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. An agent pulled up to the scene where Brent was already standing outside. Brent followed the authorities on the property to the skull. They said suddenly Brent looked terrified. They walked towards a shed where they found a large coffin where an elderly, mummified man's body laid. A rat ran out from under his sleeve. The agent knew at this point something was seriously wrong. He told Brent to let him into the other buildings on the property, which were closed off and seemed impossible to get into. An agent walked towards a building, but couldn't seem to open the door. He lit a flashlight through the window, and saw countless bodies scattered and piled on top of each other. Hundreds of other decomposing bodies were discovered laying out in the field, in sheds, vaults, vehicles, stacked on each other like garbage. Some clothed, some weren't. Over 300 bodies were recovered across the 16-acre property. Some left there for years, untouched, unburied, and forgotten, laying in mass graves, all in various stages of decomposition. They were filled with insects, bloated, with flesh hanging off their bones. This had been going on for years at this point. The bodies were so far into decomposition that they looked as if they'd been mauled by animals. Just bones and rotting flesh covered in dirt. It's hard to convey with words just how terrifying these bodies looked. It's not a sight that most people are familiar with, as it's not often that bodies this far into decomposition are seen by human eyes in modern times. Usually, when we see dead bodies, they've been preserved with chemicals to some extent, and they're kept in clean, tidy spaces. These bodies were left to be fed on by animals and insects, and some of them were left in the sun for extended periods of time, left to nature's devices entirely. It was rumored among some of the locals of the community that Brent had put makeup on them, put wigs on them, taken pictures of them, posed them like dolls, and then just left them there to rot. Many people suspected that Brent was a necrophile, and the police claimed to have ruled this out, but the question still lingered because people wondered why else would anyone do this. The police asked Brent if there was any way that he could identify the bodies by looking at them so that their families could be notified. Brent walked around the scene, pointing out bodies and stating their names, pretending to know who was who, until he said the same name twice and the authorities called him out on it. He eventually admitted that he had no record or recollection of the identities of these bodies, and he had barely even written it down. He simply took the bodies and laid them about on the property until they had decomposed so much that they were no longer recognizable at all. The crematory at this point had become a crime scene, and would soon become the most expensive investigation in Georgia history, with the total cost of the investigation ending at about $10 million by the time it was over. Because many corpses were in advanced stages of decomposition, skeletons, partial skeletons, or mummified remains, traditional identification methods like fingerprints, clothing tags, or visible facial and bodily features just didn't work in most cases. So they had to use dental records, bone examination, and DNA testing of remains in order to identify the bodies and return them to their families. Out of 339 recovered remains, officials were able to conclusively identify about 222 of the bodies. The other 113 bodies were unable to be identified completely. They had decomposed too much for any method of identification to work, and even their DNA had become unusable by this point due to exposure to the elements. The situation was so bizarre and unprecedented that the authorities didn't even know what to charge him with, or what law he had broken. A crime had been committed, but no one knew which one. At the time, in Georgia, there was no law against desecration of a corpse. This wasn't a situation that anyone could have even thought up to make illegal. So they charged him with multiple counts of theft by deception, as it was the only existing law that really applied to what he had done. He was paid to burn bodies and then didn't burn them, meaning he had taken the money and failed to do what was asked of him. But this crime was so much worse than that, and everyone knew it. They just didn't know what to call it yet. So he got off easy for a while. There were no routine checks, no state inspectors. No one ever questioned what was going on. Brent simply told the funeral homes that the cremation was complete, and he returned boxes of ashes to the families. But what was inside of the urns that he sent out was not the Miss Girl, stop. But what was inside the urns that were sent to these families was not the remains of their loved ones. Some boxes contained wood ash, others were pulverized concrete, sand, or fireplace soot. Yet somehow nobody seemed to notice the difference. My grandfather died of cancer when my dad was a teenager. His body was sent to Tri-State. Growing up, I heard stories about what had happened. After my grandfather was cremated, my family went to their hometown 1,000 miles north to scatter his ashes over the ocean. But when the news broke, my dad learned that those ashes they had scattered were not of his father. It was just concrete dust in an urn. His body rotted away on the side of the crematory, and no one had a clue until much later. They had to use his dental records in order to identify his body because he had been on the site so long that nothing else was usable. This devastated my family, and no one knew what to make of it. I remember my mom telling me of the chaos that broke out in that house when they found out what had happened to my grandfather's body. It was like everyone had to re-mourn and revisit those same feelings as they did the moment he died. But there were signs that something was off far before any official investigation was ever in progress. Sometime in the early 1990s, my mom would have been 10. She lived in Noble at the time, about a half mile from the crematory. Tommy Marsh was still in charge of the operation at this point. One day, her dog brought home what seemed to be a human femur bone. Her neighbor was part of the Georgia State Patrol, so she asked him about it and showed it to him. Both the officer and her grandmother reassured her it was probably just a cow bone and there was nothing to worry about. So they put it out of their minds and didn't think about it any longer. Here's my theory. The authorities have speculated that Tommy Marsh was engaging in these practices far before Brent ever took over, but no one knows for sure. My mother is quite certain, based on her experience, that that bone that her dog brought her was in fact a human bone from the crematory. At the time, she didn't quite know what was going on, because how could she have? I mean, she was 10. So the full context didn't really come to her until she got older, and all of this broke out into public worldwide news. But the Tri-State Crematory opened in the mid-1970s, like I said. The bodies recovered in 2002 were in very various stages of decomposition, with some dating back much further than Brent's takeover in 1996. This means that a lack of cremation was occurring at least 4 years before Brent assumed operational control. This strongly implies that this wasn't just a sudden shift that started happening when Brent took over the business. Tommy Marsh could have easily engaged in the same practices undetected, especially since the business ran on trust between funeral homes and the crematory. Tommy was never formally investigated or charged with anything, and many believe that he was protected due to his illness and his age, and also his reputation in the community. This theory casts Brent not as a criminal mastermind, but as someone who inherited a broken system from his father, panicked, and let it spiral into one of the most horrific mass betrayals in American history. My mother has told me the story of how shocking it was when all of this news broke out, and suddenly her small town of 300 people was a topic of worldwide discussion. She told me about seeing news trucks from China at the scene of the events, which was insanely surreal to witness in a town that was so small it didn't even have a mayor. In the end, Brent Marsh was charged with 787 counts, including theft by deception, abuse of a corpse, burial service fraud, and making false statements. In November 2004, Marsh pleaded guilty, under a plea deal covering all 787 counts. As part of his plea, Marsh was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He also faced a $20,000 fine, 75 years of probation, and a requirement to write handwritten apology letters to every single family whose loved ones were found on his property. I very vividly remember being a child and my father receiving that letter in the mail. It was my 11th birthday party. I remember it was really hard on my dad, and it kind of threw off the whole vibe. I was too young to fully understand what was going on, but I could tell by the vibe shift that it was very important. It wasn't until I got older that I fully understood and was able to do research of my own. In response to all of this, Georgia lawmakers revised funeral industry laws. They introduced stricter oversight, including felony-level penalties for corpse abuse or abandonment. Many families of the deceased filed civil lawsuits against the crematory operators, primarily Brent Marsh and related parties, alleging fraud, breach of contract, negligence, emotional distress, and mishandling of remains. Ultimately, the civil suits resulted in a joint settlement fund to compensate many of the families involved. However, the exact amount of money is not publicly disclosed and has been inconsistent across multiple sources. Some sources, though, claim it was several $million. The reason being, many settlements were confidential and involved non-disclosure agreements, so the full scope of the compensation people received is hidden from public view. But despite the legal closure, both criminally and civilly, many of the victims' families say that they never got true closure, because Marsh never fully explained why he failed to cremate the bodies. That still remains a mystery to everyone. During a court session, more than 24 relatives of victims delivered personal victim impact statements over the course of 6 hours, asking him why he would do this, how it ended up this way, begging for any explanation at all as to what his motives were. One woman said, "We are sentenced for the rest of our lives to not knowing what happened, and he's not going to tell us." To which Brent replied, "To those of you who may have come here today looking for answers, I cannot give them to you." He offered an apology, but no explanation. To this day, it remains a mystery to everyone how this started, why this started, and when it started. There are many people who wonder where Brent Marsh is now, after his release in 2016, but it seems that he has avoided all public attention since his release. There is no record of his current whereabouts, or anything about him really. Since that day, it's as if he's completely disappeared from society. What happened at Tri-State will never fully make sense. Hundreds of people trusted that the final chapter of their loved ones' lives would be handled with dignity, and they paid large sums of money to ensure the well-being of their loved ones after death. Instead, they were denied the basic right to even be laid to rest. There's something uniquely painful about having to mourn a death twice. Once when someone dies, and then again when you find out that their body was never treated properly. The families affected weren't just robbed financially, they were robbed entirely of peace. Brent Marsh walked free almost 10 years ago. But for the families that lived through this, justice never felt complete. There was never a why, there was never an explanation, there was never even remorse that matched the damage that was done. And that's why this remains the darkest story in the history of the funeral industry. Not just because of what happened, but because there's no way to ever undo the damage.